Well, before we begin, I would like to remind you to pick up your headsets because we will mix languages. We'll be going back and forth between Polish and English. And for those of you who are putting on your headsets, we can run a little sound check. Hopefully you can hear. And again, a little sound check for those of you who are just putting on your headsets. Well, hello. I would like to welcome you to the Institute for Western Affairs, one of the oldest research and analytical institutes in Poland. The institute has been around for nearly 8 decades, providing its expertise, commentaries on Polish-German relations, Now, this conference has been prepared by a team of the Institute for Western Affairs involved in international politics and in charge for the substance as well as organizational matter of this conference. I would like to give my accepting our invitation. To it. And then in the 1950s, where all, all of the blocs were still running strong and nobody expected any changes to the division of Europe, research being carried out on Europe and later on the European Union itself. Now, this topic is something that is a challenge for the member states of the EU and something that is going to define our future in years to come. Move on to the first panel, which I will have the honor to moderate. I would like to welcome all of our speakers and thank all of our speakers for coming to Poznan. I would like to welcome as well those speakers who are with us online and thank our guests for coming. My special thanks go to our befriended school, which often sends its students to our events, and especially to class 2D, mistaken, and to Brons Wójcik. Now, before we move on to our panel, I would like to give the floor to the Foundation to say a few words. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here together.
Welcome you also on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. For more than 30 years, the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation has been working from Warsaw, from the Warsaw office, to deepen German-Polish relationship, like the West Institute doing this from Poznan. Over contribution through political advice together. We are very happy to be partner of the West Institute for this our discussions, because we are bringing here together German experts, and it's quite important that we compare our perspectives and positions also when it comes to China. We all know that beyond the acute foreign policy threat posed by Russia, China is the most is something new. Also for but since China and Germany, representatives of German businesses, but also the political public, are increasingly concerned with reducing dangerous dependencies from China, and the by the way, also a China strategy, which will be published this year, and which I assume will definitely emphasize this new role of China. Unlike in the previous years, Germany will have to position itself more broadly in order to not make the same mistakes Germany did, and you all know this, with the dependency on Russia. So we the trap that we made with too close connections to Russia. And when you compare the economic partnership with China these days and the dependency, it's even more challenging to going to discuss this as well today. Likewise, we will discuss as well Poland's relationship with China. Warsaw, and maybe somebody of you is remembering this, was once the founding place of China's 17+1 initiative, and President Duda maintained close ties with China until the outbreak of the pandemic. What is definitely certain is that we will have to readjust our relationship with China, if possible, even on a European basis. And I'm pleased that we are discussing these issues today with proven experts. Thanks to Justina Schulz and his team once again for incorporating us in this project, and I wish us everybody a successful conference. Many thanks.
To ja teraz poproszę naszych panelistów, żeby zabrać.
I would like to ask our speakers to please join us at the head table.
Witam serdecznie naszych.
Welcome cordially to our panelists. Director Daniel Gregos has given you an outline in brief of the problems and the tensions that are faced in relations between the EU and China, as well as in relations between the member states of the European Union. Well, it's kind of a cliche these days to say that the attack of Russia on Ukraine triggered a process of change. Germany adopted the concept of Zeitenwende, which has forced us to redefine the position of the EU and individual EU member states in the security structure and generally in geopolitics. Now, to refer to this tension that exists, I would like to quote two positions. On the one hand, the words of the head of the biggest chemical company in the world, BASF, Mr. Buchmüller, who said that you cannot compare the challenges having to do with Russia and China. Russia could be replaced with other suppliers. And the big mistake for BASF was not to have done that early enough, while China cannot be replaced in any way. Now, if the European industry wants to remain in the lead, it must be present in that market. So that is one position, one point of view. On the other hand, we know that between the United States and China, there is a pronounced rivalry, and that the United States expects its European allies to provide support to it in this very competition. We know how important the United States is for security in Central and Eastern Europe, also in the context of the war in Ukraine. Well, I think these are the challenges that Europe is facing. The question is how to develop a common compromise and policy on China. So that, among others, is the problem we're going to discuss. We have brought together outstanding experts. We have among us a representative of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Michał Skrzek, a representative of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Martin Thümer, and a representative of the European Parliament, the research section, Kjeld van Wieringen. The three gentlemen deal with China not only in theory, but also in practice. They've been to China. Martin Thümer was the head of the political section in the German embassy in Beijing. Michał Skrzek was a political advisor in the EU delegation in Beijing, while Mr. van Wieringen worked in Taiwan. So you can already see the tension that they have experience with and the challenges that we are facing vis-à-vis China. I requested 10-minute presentations from our experts outlining the position of their countries, after which we will open the floor to the audience for questions. Why don't we begin with Michał Skrzek, who will present to us the Polish position on the challenges having to do with China. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. For starters,
my intentions for this panel, I will say a few words in Polish language, my introductory remarks, and then I will switch back to English for the discussion part. Szanowni Państwo,
thank you very much. I would like to thank the Institute as well as the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for organizing this event. As we hear, this is the first post-pandemic external public conference. This one's about China, so, well, a very good job, I believe. The world, ladies and gentlemen, the world, and that might be a cliche as well, is facing uncertainty. Not only in Europe, in our nearest neighborhood, but also throughout the world, in international trade, in defense, and supply policies, and food security. As a global actor, China has a particular role to play. It also has a responsibility that must be mentioned in bilateral relations, as well as within the EU. From the Polish perspective, well, we have had relations with China on three planes. One of those is a bilateral channel, the other is the EU-China channel, and the third one is the multilateral channel, multi-regional channel, including the Central and Eastern Europe-China format. Now, I would like to present the Polish position on all these channels. Regarding the bilateral relations channel, China is a partner that you cannot ignore in any way. China will remain the main trading partner of Poland in Asia and the second largest in the world after Germany, globally speaking, with a volume of trade exceeding 56 billion euros last year. Unfortunately, in these trading relations, there is a certain problem. We have a deficit, a trade deficit, and the imbalance of trade currently is 18-1. We import 18 times more from China than we sell to China. Now, faithful to our interests and values, Poland is engaged in a pragmatic dialogue with China. In its strategic bilateral relations and partnership, Poland maintains an extended structure of intergovernmental relations with China. Nevertheless, I must stress that our priority in our relations is to focus on our economic objectives that are based on reciprocity and on a level playing field. These are very important terms, not only for us from the point of view of Poland, but also for the entire EU and many member states, as I understand. We also see a number of challenges in our bilateral relations. It's not going to be a surprise, I believe, to say that Poland and China don't see eye to eye on Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Poland, and specifically its president Andrzej Duda, even before the war broke out in February last year, warned China regarding the intentions of Russia and the possible consequences of a war breaking out in Europe. The consequences of this aggression in Ukraine and the ambiguous position of China on that aggression negatively affect the international reputation of China and the perception of that country in Poland. Secondly, the EU-China channel, well, Poland supports fully the EU's position on China being a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. From our point of view, the EU, and let's not be afraid of saying this, is an economic superpower that should be able to prepare to compete on equal terms with, and we should prepare to compete on equal terms with countries such as China. To that end, we will have to make a concerted effort to create proper trade and investment instruments and instruments that can be used in cases of economic coercion and political coercion. Notably, the situation in China is as follows, and I'm referring to the 2 sessions of the parliament in China that have shown that under Xi Jinping, China is on a path towards self-sufficiency in economic terms. And that self-sufficiency would make it less dependent on democratic economies. Now, whether or not China can afford to break all ties with the external world and Europe in its trade is debatable. It should also be noted that for some time now, China has modified its narrative regarding the European Union, putting or removing pressure from EU integration towards strategic autonomy. Now, the way China understands Europe's autonomy is obvious. The point mainly is to be independent of the United States. Now, from the Polish viewpoint, this precisely is the key to resolving the question asked by the organizers in the title of this conference, meaning how to strengthen Europe's position in the systemic rivalry against China. The concept of strategic autonomy does not only concern China, of course, but it is something that deserves more of our attention. From the Polish viewpoint, strategic autonomy of the EU, that kind of autonomy that we would like to achieve, would involve, among others, three things. One, cooperation between the EU and the North Atlantic Alliance in defense and security. Secondly, developing an EU sanction policy as an instrument of responding to non-standard security threats in politics. And thirdly, achieving resilience to potential external shocks that might result in the deficiency of key resources in Europe, in Europe's economy. Now, the means towards these ends within the EU should be as follows. Firstly, a very tight alliance with NATO. Then Europe's unity, and finally, trading relations with like-minded partners. Now, this list is not exhaustive. It does not cover all of the Polish understanding of the strategic effectiveness of the EU. That understanding is much more extensive and covers more areas, such as the internal market, the climate and energy policy, the digital policy, and critical resources. Nevertheless, it is essential for the EU to continue developing ties across the Atlantic and to continue maintaining alliances with like-minded partners all across the world. I'd like to stress as well that our efforts should include reaching out to partners, especially in the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia, and generally the global South, because that is central for maintaining the rule-based order that we know today and that has been beneficial to all of us. Thirdly, as mentioned earlier, Poland's relations with China are upheld in regional fora as well. And as noted, since 2012, Poland has been involved in the Central and Eastern Europe-China format, and I'm not using any numbers here because those numbers change continuously. So let's call it the Central and Eastern Europe-China format. Now, this cooperation is secondary, the way we see it, especially in this day and age, when this mechanism is in crisis after 3 countries, Baltic countries, have left it. It is also notable that the lack of measurable effects of this cooperation and China's ambiguity on Russia's aggression on Ukraine are vital, not the only factors, but vital factors that affect this format of cooperation. From the Polish point of view, however, the format continues to be an additional channel for relations with China, which does not mean that we are not verifying its usefulness on an ongoing basis in terms of Poland's foreign policy priorities. In addition, and I'd like to stress this, from the point of view of Poland's broader interest and the broader interest of the EU, the European part of the format creates conditions that are conducive to better European coordination of our values and policies towards China, which is a big advantage of this format. Now, in closing, allow me to stress that what's vital in our relations with China is as follows. We no longer make political gestures and concessions as Europe. The result of COVID-19 and the consequences of Russia's war on Ukraine and the changes that we've been observing within China change our perception of that country. We are much more realistic in our perception of China these days. Now, the results of this in Europe, the operation of NGOs and think tanks has shown that the ability to understand the situation in China has been improved. Various analyses and publications and the work of think tanks in Europe has improved our capacity to understand where China stands and where it's going. So that's how I see this conference as well. It is a very important contribution to learning about China and exchanging knowledge, and I would like to thank the organizers for this. So here's my thanks, and I give up the floor. Thank you.
Thank you a lot for this very brief presentation, but full of content. In a minute, we will go back to some of the details. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Martin Thümel to present the German stance on the challenges revolving around China.
Yeah, this is on. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Director Schulz, and I'm very grateful to the Institute Zachodny to invite me. I'm really delighted to be here in Poland to discuss our China policy. And if I had only 10 seconds to answer the question posed by this conference, how can Europe's position be strengthened? I would say if Germany and Poland work very closely together on China, but since which we are, by the way. But since I have 10 minutes, I'll try to give you a longer answer, and also, as I've been asked, elaborate a little bit on Germany's China strategy, a document that we have been working on for many months now, and which hopefully, as Mr. Gregor from the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation has said, will see the light of day in the coming months. I think it is important to start off with the tasking this government, the federal German government, has given itself with regards to the China strategy. The most important element of that tasking is called in order to implement our values and interests in the systemic rivalry with China, we require a comprehensive China strategy within the framework of the common European China policy. All these elements in this tasking are important to us. I would like to add, as the Polish colleague has said, we see ourselves firmly grounded in the EU's so-called multifaceted approach to China, which has three elements: cooperation, partner, competitor, and systemic rival. Systemic rival, not strategic rival. That's a difference, and maybe you have a chance to come back to that. But I think the tasking in our so-called coalition agreement is quite clear. It stresses systemic rivalry, and it is a fact of the development of recent years that this element of the so-called trilogy of EU-China relations has increased in importance. I won't take up too much of my time here to elaborate what these changes are, why this has happened, but I would like just to name a few things. A few have been mentioned already. Over recent years, we've seen a considerable toughening of internal repression in China, not just Xinjiang, not just Tibet, in the entire country. We've seen basically the overturning of freedoms in Hong Kong. This is the internal picture. If you look at China's external posture, you see a relentless arms buildup, and you see an arms buildup especially in all the fields that pertain to projecting power, especially maritime power, navy, Air Force, and other fields. We see a relentless pursuit of China's illegal territorial claims in the South China Sea, underpinned by setting up military infrastructure, underpinned by the use of military and paramilitary forces. We see a similar picture in the East China Sea, and we see a worrying trend of threatening gestures in the Taiwan Strait. There is one other element I'd just like to highlight. There are many, and that is China's international posture, China's posture in the multilateral system, and this is where systemic rivalry comes in particularly strongly. We see China developing more and more its own vision of a global order. It is coming up with new initiatives almost day by day. There is a third one in the making. After a global development initiative, we have a global security initiative. Now we might have a global civilization initiative. And these concepts, which are very popular in parts of the global south, tend to selectively apply universal principles laid down in the UN Charter and other universal documents, and tend to create an additional layer, at least, to the global multilateral system, which in China's view is dominated by the West, especially the US, does put individual human rights aside for the benefit of collective rights. So China is, some would say, starting to undermine, at least it is starting to deform parts of the global system. And we as Europeans, made up of smaller and middle-sized states, rely very, very heavily on a functioning rules-based global order, even more so than the United States. And this is, I think, why we as Europeans feel this Chinese challenge so acutely in that particular field. And that is a systemic question. It is not a strategic question. We are no strategic rivals. We are not fighting with China over global dominance. That would be really European overreach. So those are those elements, and I would like to elaborate a bit on our answer. So our fundamental assumption in our China strategy is that China has changed. China has changed, and the impact of what China does has changed enormously. Therefore, we must change. So that's a simple assumption we start out with. And I'm happy to say that I don't really see a sort of controversy around this amongst most member states in the EU, and also not within the European institutions. So what is our answer? Of course, the mantra, the European mantra, but it's a mantra, but it is just important to stress. The answer is European cohesion and European unity. And I must say, having observed Chinese policy over and been part of that as far as the German government is concerned for over 25 years now, I have seen very bad days in European coherence over China. When I was in Beijing last in 2014-15, we kept fighting about a joint approach. This has improved enormously. There are still some fights on, but if you look at the measures the European Union has taken to strengthen its resilience, in trade language terms, sharpen its offensive policy tools, but also its defensive policy tools, not just trade policy. These have basically gone through the legislative machinery pretty much without a glitch. But we have a colleague from the European Parliament, academic services, who might have a different take on that or know more about this. So that is the first answer. The second answer, a Polish colleague has said that too, is besides strengthening ourselves, is reducing dependencies, reducing critical dependencies, and diversifying our political and economic relationships. Now, about the economic relationship, we have had a record in trade figures with China last year. It's now close to 300 billion euros. And Germany used to be a country which had an almost balanced trading relationship with China. That is changing now too. We have an enormous Chinese surplus. It remains to be analyzed whether this is the result of some temporary developments or whether this is structural. By the way, the US has had the same experience. They had a trade record last year too. They had $700 billion trade with China, despite the not just sharpening rhetoric between China and the United States. So when it comes to reducing dependencies, we have to look very specifically at critical dependencies and at security relevant dependencies. It's been analyzed not just by German experts that 80–90% of all trade that's done with China is not relevant in that regard. Trade isn't everything, investment is an important aspect too, but we have to pinpoint and look exactly where those sectors are, and that's being done at the moment. And there are some very worrying developments over the last 10 years, just to name the solar industry example. 10–12 years ago, Germany was the world's largest manufacturer of solar cells. Now this has almost completely moved to China in terms of manufacturing of solar cells. China controls 90%. This is the result of an incredibly aggressive state spending scheme. It is the result of partly legal and partly illegal trade maneuvers by China. And of course there is rare earths and there are a lot of other things, and that will be part, I think, of the second panel. So how do we reduce these dependencies? This is a multifaceted answer. I think one is, I'll just mention one, diversification of political and economic partnerships with other countries. Just one example, tomorrow the Federal Chancellor with 6 cabinet ministers will go to Japan to have our first government consultations with Japan. That is a format that we I think it's a German thing to have this sort of format where half a cabinet meets the cabinet of some strategic partners. This is for the first time with Japan. This is a demonstration that we're serious about diversification, not just in the economic field. At the same time, this new government will maintain its government consultations with China. So this is where the sort of maybe pragmatic part of the relationship comes in. There are a number of other very important elements. Security. We have to take a more clear-eyed look at the security implications of our cooperation contacts with China. We are very worried about Chinese attempts at illegitimate influencing in our societies. We've had the discussion of the so-called Chinese police stations, the Chinese service stations. We've told China this must stop immediately, this is illegal. We have harassment of Chinese citizens in our countries, but not just Chinese citizens. We have influences, we have a problem with cyber attacks and so on and so forth. But there is one important thing, because I also see students, school pupils here in the audience. We also generally want to and need to maintain people-to-people contacts with China, and we need academic exchange, we need tourism, we want scientific exchange. So I think we need to zero in on sensitive areas, but we must at all costs prevent a general suspicion cast on any kind of contact with Chinese people in Europe. In fact, we want to increase that. So this is important because there is a worrying trend of looking a little bit acting like the Chinese government, looking at everything through a security angle. We need to be more security conscious, but we must not go the Chinese way. And the National People's Congress is a very good example to this, to declare that security is the basis of everything, of development, and to basically securitize our societies. I don't think there's a risk of that, but it's something to look out for. So being a China person who loves China, I can just encourage anyone, go there, speak to Chinese, make friends with the Chinese people and so on. And there are certain areas, proliferation relevance, high tech and so on, where we have to take a closer look. But that should not change that general picture. One point about cooperation with China, I've now mentioned one area. Just to maybe mention 2 areas where cooperation with China is absolutely essential, and why. One is climate. China by now is the world's largest CO2 emitter, about 30%. But not only that, it is also by now, and that shows the incredibly rapid economic development that China has shown, it is historically the second largest CO2 emitter. That means the sum total of all emissions from the past and today, in that respect, China is number 2 in the world. And that means we need to cooperate with China first of all, to encourage China to reduce its own CO2 emissions, to finally come up with a date of a carbon peak. They've not done that before 2030. Up to now, in the last few years, the record has been quite a good one, but it needs to be seen whether that is a result of a downturn of the economy or of real structural changes. But also in the international scene, China also has a responsibility, and so do we, to help those states that are particularly vulnerable in the fight against climate change and who are vulnerable to the effects of climate change, especially the small island development states. Just one other area I'd like to mention, peace and security. Of course, it remains absolutely essential that we work with China on North Korea. This is a very worrying development we have in the area. Afghanistan. And China, let's not forget, remains the largest contributor to United Nations missions and troops amongst the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. That's very important to maintain the peacekeeping capacities of the United Nations. Now, my time is almost up. You might have noticed I have not even mentioned China's position in the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, because what I wanted to say, all that I've mentioned has happened before. So we've had a trend over the last few years to have a more clear-eyed view of China, to be less naive, if you may, on the potential of our relationship and maybe less conscious of the challenges in that relationship. But it is completely, I agree with you, Mrs. Schulz, there's at least one thing that one can say, that this situation now, the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, has jolted us more into action. I think we basically now see that everything we've been analyzing in the last few years, reducing dependencies, increasing our own resilience, and so on and so forth, is urgent. So it has created a sense of urgency that we must start now, because as we all know, reducing dependency on not just rare earths, on active pharmaceutical ingredients, what have you, takes a decade or more. So we have to start now doing this, and I'm actually quite optimistic because the European togetherness on this has really taken enormous stride in the last few years. We can maybe discuss on where we can still improve on that. I see no one who is really saying anything basically contradicting the direction in which we have to go. There is a lot of attention, but maybe I should say this for transparency's sake, there is a controversy when it comes to publicly condemn China's human rights record. That still is sort of quite a weak spot. If you need all 27 member states to agree on that, we run into problems. So we've worked ourselves around that. That is sort of certainly something, the naming and shaming part of our policies that's a point where we're not very much united. On the other hand, that's also something that separates us a bit from the United States. We have a very close analysis of what China does and what China's intentions are, and the damage that it is causing. Even the areas where we need to cooperate is almost identical between the US and us, but the methods are a bit different. So that's maybe something we can elaborate a little bit later. So I've overshot my time, I apologize.
Bardzo dziękuję. Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you a lot for this presentation. You have touched upon quite a few interesting points, and we will go back to them in our discussions. But before we do that, I would like to ask Mr. Kjeld van Veringen to present his stance, his vision on the relationship with China and on the challenges that the EU is facing in this topic as a community. I'm giving you the floor.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion on topics which I personally agree are of an existential importance for the future of Europe. Just to correct something from the first introduction, I have not worked in Taiwan, only studied independently for a short period the Chinese Mandarin language there. There may have been a slight mistake somewhere. I personally cannot talk for the European Parliament. This is only what the European delegates can do collectively. But to give you a bird's eye view of EU-China relations and trajectories anyway, I can share with you the results of my study on the EU-China relations towards 2030 based on 171 survey responses from European China experts. So I can share with you, let's say, the collective vision of our European China knowledge community. The European China relationship is, of course, first and foremost economic. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, economic relation and trade relation in the world. And when it comes to Europe's trade agenda vis-à-vis China, the experts, our European experts, emphasize that we must prioritize gaining reciprocity in market access in the coming decade, and in the second spot also mitigate dependencies, indicating the rising importance of supply security, as we can all see in the discourse right now. The European Parliament in recent years has also emphasized its concern about, quote, the increasingly unbalanced bilateral economic and trade relationships between the EU and China, stressing that rebalancing and a more level playing field are vital to EU interests, including in the context of the EU's ongoing work in strengthening its trade toolbox. This trade toolbox refers to Europe's up-and-coming, updated, and strengthened trade defense instruments, including foreign direct investment screening, the international procurement instrument, the distortive foreign subsidies regulation, the anti-coercion instrument, the corporate due diligence regulations, dual-use export controls, and more recently the CHIPS Act for semiconductor supply security, and the announced Critical Raw Materials Act. So when it comes to the EU's approach on infrastructure and Chinese finance or Chinese-built infrastructure within its borders, the experts call for more active regulation and for providing alternatives to Chinese-built or Chinese-financed infrastructure. A very pertinent recent example is the Croatian Pelšak Bridge, which opened in July 2022, which was worth 420 million euros, largely financed by the EU, but built by a Chinese state-owned company. And thus it was opened with Chinese fanfare, with Chinese fireworks, with a speech from China's Prime Minister here in Europe. The EU's new international procurement instrument, which came to force only a few months later in August 2022, will serve to block foreign contractors from any country like China that does not grant European bidders access to their own infrastructure market. Normally, if this instrument is implemented properly, these projects are thus a thing of the past. When it comes to another investment, another important topic, the comprehensive agreement on investment, the experts proposed mainly to renegotiate the deal rather than ratify it as it stands right now. Because there's many clauses in that deal that, in fact, worsen our position vis-à-vis China rather than ameliorate it. One example here is media. On media, the experts supported EU monitoring and restriction of Chinese financing of European media. Because while European companies are unable to invest in Chinese media, Chinese investors are largely free to acquire European news services and other media assets. And a comprehensive agreement on investment would have cemented this lack of reciprocity, one of many cases, in place by assuring that Chinese media investors in most member states be treated in the same way as local entities, without improving access for European investors in China's media sector. Despite the concerns voiced very explicitly and very clearly by European parliamentarians about European media outlets being targeted by Chinese mergers and acquisitions in recent years, opening the door, of course, for disinformation and other problems. A example that was mentioned in my report and that we now see play out recently is the issue of TikTok, of social media. This also plays here. When it comes to technology, we see that the experts also propose more active regulation, because for instance, for 2016 to 2020, the EU paid for 500 million to of the 630 million, so 80%, of the EU-China co-funding mechanism for joint research projects. Despite European researchers' continuous complaints about unequal access and the lack of reciprocity in information sharing in EU-China joint research projects. Large-scale Chinese funding of individual European researchers in crucial domains nevertheless continues largely unnoticed, as is noted in the recent research by the Czech Republic's Dr. Karaskova. So, one issue related to both infrastructure and technology is 5G. So when it comes to how the EU should approach the deployment of European 5G networks by Chinese providers, telecom companies in Europe, here as well the experts proposed further regulations and additional security standards. Many member states have already moved to de facto ban Chinese telecoms from the 5G networks. And Germany has so far lagged a bit behind, but they are starting to probe into their dependencies on Chinese and Huawei's 5G network components right now as well, so they may catch up. So the experts also provided their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats assessment of EU-China relations in the coming decade. And this assessment, comprehensive assessment, indicates that European-China experts are aware that Europe's large single market, as well as its authority to regulate external commercial relations, could be considered its most useful asset in steering relations with China in a more advantageous direction. So controlling market access, basically. High hopes remain for climate cooperation with China among the experts still, despite such cooperation having stalled over the past 5 years. Finally, the perception of weaknesses and threats underlined by the experts, shows the anxiety concerning Europe's perceived difficulties in acting in unity in confronting geopolitical challenges posed by China, in large part stemming from the EU's relatively underdeveloped CFSP mandates. So it's a common foreign and security policy mandate, which, compared to its much more robust economic competencies, remains relatively weak. So when we're looking forward towards 2030, we could anticipate that European policymaking on China will likely gravitate further towards systemic rivalry through internal resilience building and external coalition formation against authoritarian interference, such as disinformation. The economic competition aspect will witness growing unilateral leveraging of European market access to improve economic reciprocity with China and international partnership diversification for improved supply security. Despite popular hopes, EU-China cooperation on climate and global issues does risk to stagnate further in the coming decade. So, whether EU-China relations will continue spiraling towards systemic rivalry and away from partnership also largely depends on China itself. It's largely out of Europe's hands. It will depend on Chinese positions on, for instance, Ukraine, Taiwan, and reciprocity. And China's newly published policies promise still more of China's economic securitization, economic decoupling, technological struggle versus the West, and assertiveness in its foreign policy. So as seen from Europe, unfortunately, the outlook for Beijing's future policy-making trajectory remains rather pessimistic. The EU's capability to effectively respond to these challenges in this decade will certainly, undoubtedly, determine to a very great extent Europe's future strength, prosperity, and security in the world. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you for this final statement, and I can fully subscribe to it myself. That is precisely why this topic is so important, and that is precisely why we would like to discuss it. Well, I'm going to be more controversial, I believe, in reference to what we have just heard. My impression here has been that the solution should be to come together, work together, join forces, and then we should be successful to reducing China's influence and roll it back. Well, I'm not sure if this is the right way to go, because the response to the war in Ukraine has shown us that the world is more divided and more complex, and that the West's soft power has actually diminished, while China has its own vision of the global order. And just as we spoke about Germany, it's become a Gestaltungsmacht, which is modeling the geopolitical order. So my impression, and by the way, we see it in the debate, you've spoken about reciprocity, etc. Now, in the European debate, the claim that is being made is that the changes in the internal market have shown that we are becoming more Chinese, while China is assuming our narrative about opening the market, becoming liberal, and allowing everybody in on an equal footing, while our solution are gravitating toward greater state interventions and allowing state aid, which actually undermines the idea of a common market, which you yourselves call one of the biggest assets in the rivalry against China. I would like to refer to perhaps one more point. And my question is, how do you see this? Because, well, the European Union is strong as a union, but it's also strong, deriving its strength from the strength of individual member states. So every channel of communication with China at the level of the member states should also, in my view, be considered a benefit and a strength rather than a threat. I'm talking about the channel of Central and Eastern Europe in talking to China. Therefore, well, based on this description, I think that the biggest vulnerability in responding to the Chinese challenge lies in divisions within the EU and the lack of a forum or a language to speak about these divisions openly, trying to find a compromise. Could you please speak to this and to what the other speakers have said? I'll give you a chance to respond briefly, and then we'll go to a Q&A. So one by one, starting perhaps in the same order.
For these comments, obviously I very much share the remarks from my colleagues from Germany and the European Parliament. I don't want to sound too shallow in my analysis, but I very much agree, and I share the fact that the reciprocity is indeed the key, because to our relationship with China. And I can share one of my professional experience that I had back in 2020 when I was still with the European External Action Service. We were negotiating a document, another document which was called EU-China Agenda 2025. It was supposed to replace EU-China Agenda 2020. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this document, but I very much suggest you to have a look. But then in 2020, we were negotiating another document to replace the previous one. And this document was referring to practically all aspects of EU-China relations. It was like a huge 40+ pages document. And the reason why we couldn't finalize it, or we couldn't arrive to the same conclusion with China, was indeed, among other things, the issue of reciprocity and level playing field. So China doesn't want it, but it's essential for us to have it. The case of the bridge in Croatia, which was financed in, I don't know, 85% by the EU money, but the project was executed by a Chinese company, this kind of situation is not going to happen in China. I mean, any kind of European company would not be able to execute, to construct a similar infrastructure in China on this kind of terms that the Chinese government is paying for that. Obviously, for the reciprocity, there are also much more difficult areas like the media. Of course, it was just mentioned here that we should do something about that. Obviously, we live in a liberal democratic societies that there is a free media and everyone is practically free to say whatever they want. The ownership of the media outlets is also quite liberal. It's not the case in China. But as I said, this is much more difficult element. Of course, we might be accused of some protectionist measures, but still, if you compare our economic regime in the European Union and the Chinese economic regime, you will see that we are much more open, and we create extremely favorable environment for the outside world. What needs to be also underlined here? It's another kind of buzzword in our relationship with China is the promise fatigue. You said that China now may have kind of upper hand, better narrative, may be perceived in a much better way by the international community because they are saying that they are opening for the outside world, they are accepting foreign investors in the country. But, you know, certain things are just a narrative, and another thing is just, it's an action. So, honestly, we don't see that much action, we see a lot of narrative. And this is also related to many different international initiatives that were mentioned here. We just saw yesterday or a few days ago that China proposed another, its global initiative on civilization. It already has global initiative on security and global development initiative. I would also add global initiative on data security, which is also quite important because it concerns this, let's say, internet governance issue. So this is just certain things are for narrative, certain things needs to be analyzed through the prism of action. You just also mentioned the implications or the consequences of the war, of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Frankly speaking, we see this situation in a slightly different manner. We see that the West or liberal democracies finally managed to work out a common position and a common response in the face of this kind of acute threat. And I believe that our Chinese colleagues are analyzing very carefully in this case, and there might be some kind of scenario planning for the region as well. Okay, I will stop here and maybe then.
Yes, thank you very much. No, I think these are really wonderful and refreshing comments and questions. I just pick up on a few things. Indeed, it would be short-sighted to say we just need to kind of work more closely within the EU, intensify our work with our like-minded partners, and then everything will be fine. I won't use the term that you used. We're not about rolling back or anything like that. It's not the kind of language we use. I think it's been slightly, we mentioned in passing, the so-called global south, which is not a good term, but we don't have a better one at the moment. That is the crucial actor in this entire scenario. And I think we talked a lot about defending ourselves and so on. I think this is where the positive side should come in. If you look at Africa or Southeast Asia like ASEAN, none of these countries or regions want to choose between two camps. And I think as soon as we try and do that, we will fail. This is something that is, of course, also important to our United States friends who are aware of this. And I think this is a field where we can get much better by not trying to exacerbate this sort of bipolar rivalry, by making better offers. And I'll give you an example. China is home to, it depends on the kind of minerals, home to some rare earths to the tune of 60 to 70%, but it is 90% of all refining of those rare earths takes place in China. That means that China buys these minerals from other countries, African countries and others, imports, has them shipped to China, refines them there. And in many other fields, that's the same thing. The bridge in Croatia is a similar thing where 90% of them. We have to get much, with our offers, we have to make a better counter offer, and we have to make sure, and we are not perfect at this, to say the least, that local content is, and local value creation is allowed in developing countries. So if we do embark now on raw materials partnerships and so on, we must make sure we don't send in just our workers, we don't just send in our materials, we allow local content to be created. And that actually requires quite a lot of change of rules. And that's, I think, where I see an opportunity where Europe could be an attractive partner. There's this Global Gateway Initiative, which we strongly support. We're slowly kind of developing a flagship project. It's all a bit slow, but that goes in the right direction. So we have we have actually something on offer, also systemically, and that puts those countries in a sweet spot, because then they get a choice. They get a positive choice in their investment. Just one final thing, I won't comment on everything so that the other colleagues can speak too and questions come in. 14+1, I mean, I don't name a number. You know, that's been a tricky thing for Germany. To be quite frank, under the previous government, Chancellor Merkel was quite outspoken with the Chinese, telling them this is an attempt at dividing Europe, we don't like it. At that time, we got a lot of pressure from our Central European, Eastern European friends saying, don't meddle with this, you know. Actually, but we also had a different experience. There was one member state of that group that complained that Germany was putting pressure on them to remain in it in order to avoid, you know, getting too aggressive on China. So it's kind of, we watch this, we tend to think it's not helpful. But of course, we also want to say that it is up to every single member of that group to say whether they want to stay in or want out. China is now on a charm offensive track because it sees that this sort of division of Europe is not working very well at the moment. China isn't always winning. It's not winning on that one. So they're trying to ingratiate themselves a little bit with partners there. But we have to be watchful. There'll be other times where and we've seen this with Lithuania, the coercive measures against Lithuania, where China will act more aggressively against European interests as it has done in the past.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was an interesting point that you said that China helps us to make better development politics. Okay, but now I would like to hear the comments of our colleague from the European Parliament. Please.
I think your comments on member state involvement is extremely relevant, because the EU can't do this alone and the member states can't do this alone, right? So, for instance, the parliaments on all levels, on the national level, member state level, and in Brussels on the EU level, will together be vital in the policy-making process to increase Europe's resilience vis-à-vis China and Europe's position vis-à-vis China, which is a generational effort. Sometimes Brussels will lead, for instance, but also through its member states representatives, and sometimes the capitals will lead. This is both possible. For instance, in Germany now you have talk about perhaps an outbound foreign direct investment screening mechanism. Experts are saying if Berlin implements this, then the EU will follow, and we will, start talking about this. So it can go both ways, and I don't see any competition here. I think we need each other vis-à-vis China. I would also like to emphasize what has been said before by Mr. Thümmel about the Global South. This is indeed a hugely important topic, because these are the markets of the future. These are developing economies. These are growing populations. These are hearts and minds. And of course, the global gateway is there to start improving European strategy on investing in these economies. And as Mr. Tumel already indicated, this can be very clearly linked to our supply security ambitions, for instance, in critical raw materials, indeed. Just one specific idea. For instance, if the global gateway were to build a cobalt refining, cobalt processing plants in Congo, then the cobalt being mined in Chinese mines in Congo would go straight from there to Europe instead of first passing through China and then coming back. We would be cutting the supply chain by 4 times in length, something like this geographically, right? So we can make important strategic investments that are going to help local developing economies, provide them with more options for sustainable, for responsible, for socially inclusive projects as alternatives to China's projects, and thereby also help ourselves. This is also the up-and-coming narrative of the global gateway, which has taken shape and is now being translated into EU policy. No.
Thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo. I teraz
Thank you. It is now an opportunity for you people in the audience to ask questions. Do we have any questions? Marcin? Victor? Thank you.
To Mr. Tumel from the German Foreign Ministry, and actually I was a little bit surprised, frankly speaking, that you mentioned the issue of human rights only, so to say, at the end of your input, because recently your ministry has presented the conception of the feminist foreign policy, implying that actually the German side would put more attention on human rights issues and the issues of ethnic minorities and so on. Therefore, my question, actually, would the Federal Republic then emphasize more on the issues with regard to the Uyghur minority in China and with regard to the situation with other ethnic minorities which are living currently in China, and whether, so to say, this step by the federal government means, this proclamation of the feminist foreign policy and feminist development policy, which is also quite important in terms of development aid. Will it mean that actually the government would pay more attention to human rights issues, also with regard to China, because think tanks currently predict more harsh policies on Iran, but whether it would concern China as well, I wonder. Thank you.
Thank you. Może jeszcze jedno pytanie, tak?
Perhaps one more question. Tomek. And then Grzegorz.
I have 3 questions, but I will try to be as short as possible, to make them as short as possible. So first one would be to Mr. van Wieringen about the European member states' preferences. I just wanted to ask if you could let us know if you could identify within your research any possibility of identifying some groups within the European Union to kind of group the member states into some or several clubs or something like this with different preferences, or could we actually talk about 100% agreement between them? And I don't only mean about solutions, but also about just perception of China and of the European policy. Were there any differences? The second question would be about the comprehensive agreement on investment. It was mentioned here as well, with the idea of renegotiating it instead of ratification in the shape as we know it. We of course have seen quite a substantial engagement on the part of German government. It was still under Chancellor Merkel, who kind of pushed for the ratification, which did not happen for obvious reasons. I just wanted to ask about the position of current German government on this. Is it also one of renegotiating the agreement? If yes, in which direction? And do you see any chance, Mr. Tymel, of success here? And final question to Mr. Skrzek from Polish Foreign Ministry. We also talked about this Central European Chinese initiative with different numbers, but we also said that initially Poland was kind of center player within this initiative. We were wondering about the role Poland can play in the creating of infrastructure links also between China and Europe, also within the Belt and Road Initiative, with the example of Małaszewicze, for example, terminal. So I guess from my perspective, this chance is kind of has passed away, and I just wanted to make sure what is your opinion about this? Do you see any potential for Poland to still be kind of central player connecting China with Europe? Of course, this is to a high degree a symbolic description, but I just wanted to make sure if and how the perception of Chinese of Polish interest within this triangle has changed. Thank you very much.
My question is regarded to Mr. Rzek, to our Polish expert. The European level as well as the member states were very keen in the last couple of years to develop some kind of strategies, the Indo-Pacific strategy in Germany and in Europe. Then you mentioned the Euro-Chinese agenda, then the Global Gateway Initiative, then this new China strategy. We are not lacking in strategies and papers. This is my perception. I'm not sure if everybody in the European Union is really aware of that much paper we already produced and strategically focusing on China, but we are lacking a little bit behind in concrete actions when it comes to reciprocity, to fighting against subsidies. State-owned companies are a problem. The WTO plays a crucial role here. So how can we come to concrete action after we made so much paperwork in the last couple of years? And how can we do this basically?
Thank you very much. Ja proponuję, że
I suggest that we start with Mr. Tymel. So perhaps in this order, starting with Mr. Tymel.
Thank you very much. On human rights, I think I mentioned human rights quite soon at the beginning of my intervention. You mentioned the Tibet, Xinjiang, Tibet and Hong Kong as an example of greatly increased internal repression in China, and then I came back to that at the end. I think I don't have to blush in saying that we are leading on human rights in Europe with others, but we are certainly at the forefront. When it comes to making sure that Xinjiang is discussed at the UN level in New York or in Geneva, we are the ones pushing this together with others. We read the statements. We make proposals on EU intervention. Just another example: we're very active in observing trials in Hong Kong under the so-called security law. What is very important to us is that Tibet is not forgotten. Xinjiang, the situation, human rights situation in Xinjiang is abominable, but Tibet, because of the closure of the borders during COVID, has lost a little bit of attention, and there are very worrying developments, like the so-called boarding schools, the forced schooling of Tibetan children, who after a couple of years do no longer know their native tongue. So I should say this is definitely a priority for us, and we make our voice heard, and we will continue to make our voice heard. Feminist foreign policy. Indeed, a feminist development policy, that is another important element of that. It certainly goes to show that we'll continue to be assertive on that. And just to add to that, I don't know a single high-level exchange with China. Last one, my foreign minister with the Chinese foreign minister just a few weeks ago, where this is not discussed, and it is always discussed in, how shall I put it, I mean, it is discussed in a way that just shows how different our views on these developments are. Secondly, on the KAI, the investment agreement, well, it's not been mentioned. Of course, our colleague knows this. At the moment, the question of renegotiation is moot because the Chinese, after the EU's very justified human rights sanctions in March 2 years ago, placed sanctions on European parliamentarians and on a couple of others, Germans, Belgians, others. So if you sanction members of the European Parliament, and even entire committees, there's no point in talking about ratification yet negotiation. So the question is moot. The Chinese need to lift these sanctions first before any kind of further talk on this agreement can be started.
Yes, thank you very much. Two questions on our role in Europe as a kind of gate to China, or how you name it. We still sustain cooperation, infrastructural cooperation with China. I mean, through Europe. Poland is the fastest way to enter Europe via railway connections. We know it. China knows it. There are not that many alternatives to this connection because it takes 11, 12 days to ship cargo from China to Europe, but also from Europe to China, and it should work both ways. We indeed have a number of initiatives to improve infrastructure here in this respect, and it's still ongoing. So it's still there. It's developing, but as I said, and it needs to be underlined. And we have discussions with China to make this connection to work both ways. Obviously, during the COVID-19 pandemic, this connection has proven its value in the times of traditional shipping via sea was severely constrained. This railway connection was operational and effective. When it comes to second question, the discussions and the strategic papers that are being produced in Europe, I think those people who knows European Union would agree that we are constantly developing a project. This European initiative is constantly developing, and it's developing through discussions, negotiations, etc. Obviously, some of these strategic papers, some of these not, had much bigger impact on our awareness, on our actions. And I could tell you about this EU-China strategic outlook from March 2019, which introduced this triangulation, this partnership, systemic rival and competition part in our relationship. So some of these documents has much bigger impact on our awareness, and I can tell you that in the past 4 years we've seen a really huge proliferation of meetings, discussions within the EU on China. And this didn't happen in the past. I mean, before 2017, it was only COASI group, which is, designed to talk about Asia, the relationship with Asia, was discussing China. Not more than that. But now we have really strategic discussions on PSC, on COREPER. Even the European Council is from time to time discussing these matters. So I think it's a unfortunately long-term process. There are not easy answers and no fixed solutions, and we have to spend some time before we enter into concrete actions. But the actions are also being introduced, being done on a regular basis, and this my colleague from the European Parliament flagged a number of trade defense instruments which have been introduced or which are still being under discussion, and these things are moving our project forward. Thank you.
Yeah, so on the question of if there's different clusters of groups of member states with different views on China, I think it's hard to say. I think it used to be the case like this. You had the 16+1 in Eastern Europe, but as external experts have been observing, with lack of return, let's say, being apparent in this format, lack of Chinese investment, and then of course the Ukraine war that started, and with Eastern European countries being less and less interested in this cooperation, 16+1, Eastern European Chinese cooperation framework, due to China's stance on Russia, due to lacking investments. I think it's all quite becoming more homogeneous. We're all quite becoming more China critical, it seems. And this is also indicated as a potential opportunity by the experts, you know, that our vision seems to be growing in the same direction towards more China realism and less naivety. Of course, there are still one or two member states, or a few, that of which the economies still think they depend a lot on Chinese investments, and so there's perhaps still one or two that are able to block CFSP stances on China due to these dependencies, in order to keep the door open for Chinese investments, which makes, of course, these trade instruments all the more important, because they fall under mainly economic competencies and not the foreign policy competencies of the European Union, which are, as I said, much more robust. And then I had I saw someone on the very relevant point of what about the action, right? We're talking and we're talking, and then there's strategy after strategy, and statement after statement, and I think many experts would agree that it's the time indeed for action. But action comes in many forms, of course. They also come in policies. You need to have the frameworks to implement common action, for which, again, the parliament legislative processes on member state and European level are a vital element of that. But indeed, now is the time, it would seem, the experts would agree, for implementation and for action, rather than dialogue and negotiations and climate talks. Because if you want to get, if we want to negotiate better conditions with China, then we first need to be in a better position to negotiate, and it's exactly this action, this policy making, that improves our resilience and our position vis-a-vis China, and improves our negotiating power, let's say. Yeah, I'll keep it at that. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dziękuję.
Thank you. Thank you to all our speakers for your participation. And Mr. Grzegorz has said that we don't have to produce another document or another strategy. What we need right now is in-depth analysis, though. I do agree that now we need actions, but we still haven't said what kind of actions we are needing and in what area. An area important for me and a symbol that proves that there is the erosion of skills, of capabilities, of creating standards by the West. Namely, what I mean is that today we heard that the Swiss bank needed help, needed assistance to be saved from bankruptcy. And in our European thinking, this bank used to be the symbol of stability, of safety, and this is only one example of how China is having a big impact and has a big influence here and is creating the framework for us. And then we need to adjust to that framework and not the other way around. So how to prevent that? This will be a topic of our future discussions. And this is something we need to come up with on the level of microeconomic analysis. So thank you a lot for your participation. Now it's time for a coffee break, time for some refreshments. And after the break, I will welcome you to another panel that will be moderated by Mr. Andrzej Modrzejewski. So thank you a lot. Once again, I'd like to thank our panelists. And again, I would like to welcome you to have a coffee break during which you will have the opportunity to